Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, a show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Since Thanksgiving is now a week behind us, we are now officially in the final stretch of the year. Whether you are working full-time, whether you're in school, we're kind of getting to the point where you get to, the Christmas and New Year's holidays, where you get to take some time off to hopefully spend with family and maybe some friends as well. So as we get closer and closer to that date, remember you're almost, at the finish line. It's also kind of hard to believe that the year's almost over already. It kind of feels like 2024, at least for me, has kind of just flown by. But anyway, enough reminiscing. Let's get into this week's trivia question for the week. So, which company was founded first? Nintendo, Microsoft, Apple, or Sony? So, which of those four companies was founded first? And that is your trivia question for the week. And one of the stories I wanted to cover in this week's Operation Core Dump has to do with our cybersecurity tip. So let's get right into this week's cybersecurity tip. We've talked a decent amount in the past about making encryption work for you, and encryption is only as good as you let it. Well, we have another encryption-based cybersecurity tip for you this week, and this week it has to deal with your communications. So the FBI and CISA have issued strong warnings to U.S. citizens, urging them to use end-to-end encrypted messaging and call apps in basically in response to the ongoing cyber espionage and hacking campaign that's been attributed to China's Salt Typhoon Group, which is, one of their state-sponsored hacker groups or whatever. And essentially kind of the goal of this campaign is essentially to compromise, U.S. telecom networks and steal any kind of data that they can and intercept all kinds of communications to hopefully get data on government and other public figures to either use that against them or to harvest state secrets or, all the things that governments like to do against each other. Now, it doesn't help the fact that the 3G specification, which granted is being phased out, but is still, I believe, kind of sort of present in the networking, the cellular networking space. But essentially, the 3G specification in specific has a back door of sorts baked into it to essentially allow for those with access to the network itself to be able to listen to all communications. Now, of course, this was intended to be used for law enforcement, hence kind of the name of it being called the lawful interception architecture. So if you're interested, you can go look that up if you want to read more. But this is one of the ways that the Chinese hacker group can easily exfiltrate data, because through this back door, once they get into the telecom networks, they get free access to whatever messages they want. And if they're not encrypted, like if you're using SMS or some other non-encrypted data that's going over the telecom network, congratulations, the Chinese may now have a copy of that data. So this is one of the reasons why, as it should be obvious at this point, why you should never bake back doors into your programs, your architecture, whatever the case may be, because someone will inevitably find it and use it, and it's not going to be your intended user. So while it's, admirable that they wanted to allow law enforcement to be able to, well, I guess depending on who you are, maybe it's not admirable to allow law enforcement to so easily gain access to this data. Now, granted, they need search warrants and all that kind of good stuff. But anyway, um, of course, it's going to be used for malicious reasons once others realize it's there and can gain access to it. So let this be a reason why another reason why you should never put backdoors into anything if you actually care about the privacy and security of your users. So there's an article that I'll have listed down below from Forbes that kind of, covers this, but essentially I think we've kind of touched on some of the big things here, but the big recommendation, of course, is, like I mentioned at the top, to use end-to-end encryption for your communications. So if you're using just like standard text messages like SMS or even RCS that isn't end-to-end encrypted, those aren't going to be ideal methods of communication. Which, the funny thing here is, some people like to give Apple a hard time and Apple users a hard time for iMessage and the whole, blue bubble, green bubble thing, which, to be honest, I don't really get the whole blue bubble, green bubble thing. To me, it doesn't really make much of a difference. But to some people, it's like a deal breaker for some reason. I don't know. But anyway, the iPhone users can laugh their way to the bank because iMessage is end-to-end encrypted. And when we're saying end-to-end encrypted, if you're not familiar with that terminology, essentially what that means is when you send a message. So let's say we have two users. We have Bob and Alice, the classic cybersecurity users' names, right? So Bob wants to send a message to Alice. Bob encrypts the message before the message even leaves his device, and then it's encrypted all the way through till it gets to Alice, and then once Alice's device receives the message, it then decrypts the message so she can read it. So even in the event someone in the middle there were able to sniff the data and grab a copy of it, they wouldn't be able to decipher it at all because it's all encrypted. So that's what we're talking about when we say end-to-end encrypted. So the reason why, of course, you want to have end-to-end encrypted communications is because even if the Chinese or law enforcement or some other government agency is sniffing your traffic, they can't get anything from it because it's all garbled and encrypted because you're using end-to-end encryption. So let this again be another reminder that you should be avoiding using SMS for your two-factor authentication if possible. Now, I understand that in a decent number of cases that's not possible because it's up to the developers of the site or application that you're trying to use to implement a two-factor method that isn't SMS, so it's kind of out of your control to a point. But where applicable, if there's an option to use an authenticator app, you definitely should be using that over SMS, because in cases like this, there's a chance that there's speculation, well, not necessarily speculation, but there's a potential that there could be like some sort of, a SIM swapping or phone stealing mechanism going on. If the Chinese have full access and are fully in the networks of numerous telecom providers, they could do some funky stuff with messaging and SMS messages and steal two-factor codes and all kinds of not goodness. So, definitely try to avoid using SMS for your two-factor if possible. But again, it's better than nothing, but you should definitely be trying to avoid it if you can. So there's also been some talks about how to go about safeguarding and securing telecom infrastructure, whether that's, regulations or something. There's also talks that, essentially Apple and Google kind of being under fire for not having RCS be end-to-end encrypted. So there's kind of some legal things going on there in the background. Now, one story I did hear in regards to this is one of the reasons why some of the telecom providers were getting hacked was because they were using, wait for it, outdated firmware on their switches and routers and other networking infrastructure. So, another reminder that you should be updating your services and devices. So, when these various vulnerabilities get patched, you can make sure that you update to them so you are no longer vulnerable to them. But I think probably one of the biggest ironies here is the fact that the FBI is encouraging citizens to actually use encryption for messages and messaging, when in the past they've, kind of criticized it because it hindered their ability to do various investigations. So it's, I guess, only they can be the ones spying on the U.S. citizens and not other companies or other governments, I guess. I don't know. But that was something I did find a little bit ironic. But yeah, so I guess the TLDR here is to be, one, making sure you're using end-to-end encrypted services for your communications where possible, and also try to avoid using SMS where possible for things like authentication, and to, of course, always make sure your devices are up to date. And before we get into the nerdy things, I did find another article that I did want to talk about briefly, which is going over kind of this debate on if using AI-generated code will make you a bad programmer. Now, we've talked a few times, I believe, on the podcast in the past about kind of this topic, and my general understanding and belief on the subject is if you're trying to learn how to code for like the first time, you definitely want to avoid AI at all costs for a couple reasons. One, it can lead you down rabbit holes that you have no business going down. And two, at least in my experience, when I ask AI to generate code for me, it almost always requires a significant level of effort on my part just to get the thing to work, because the AI likes to hallucinate various methods that don't exist, or just write code that straight up doesn't compile or run, and all kinds of other issues in it. Now, I don't even know if I should say usually, but sometimes when I have asked AI to generate code for me purely out of an experimentation purposes, usually, it has the general idea correct. Like, it goes through the correct thought process of how you should go about implementing something, but the actual implementation is just either wrong, doesn't work, or it just made up a bunch of stuff. But at least you can kind of, if you know and understand, the logic behind how the program should operate, you can then kind of sort of take that outline that the AI spit out and then modify it and actually correct it so it actually works. So yeah, it definitely can be a hindrance, especially if you don't know what you're doing. And that's kind of some of the topics and points that the article brings up. One of the first key ones being the loss of learning opportunities, because if you're not the one that's actually writing the code, you don't necessarily get the hands-on experience of actually learning how to code and what goes into, writing good code. Why did I name this variable a certain way? Why did I use an integer rather than a short? Why did I use a float rather than a double? Why am I using a string rather than a character array? Things like this. If you're just copying and pasting code, you don't necessarily get that experience and kind of the understanding of why you're doing what you're doing. It's the same thing that when I was learning how to code back before AI was really a thing. There was always the mention when learning to code that you shouldn't copy and paste code even from within your own projects, because the act of retyping it out will help kind of ingrain it into your mind. And it also kind of goes back to with the whole Stack Overflow thing. Of course, the meme, of course, is that the only keys a software developer needs is the control key, the C key, and the V key, because all they're doing is copying and pasting code around. And of course, I have to say, it is nice when you can just copy and paste something from Stack Overflow and it works, which, at least in my experience, has a higher success rate than AI-generated code, but I guess that's neither here nor there. But the point being, in both cases, you lose some of the learning that would go on by copying and pasting it without really understanding what the code is actually doing and why it was implemented that way and why doing it that way works. And also kind of relying on external tools, whether it's AI generated code or Stack Overflow solutions, it makes you kind of reliant on them. So whenever you kind of hit a roadblock, rather than trying to work it out, troubleshoot it, debug the issue, you instantly try to go and find the easy solution, which is ask someone else to do it for you. So again, that kind of leads into another kind of point that the author brings up, which is kind of skill atrophy, where if you're constantly delegating, all these mundane tasks or just things you don't want to have to do to AI, you kind of lose those skills over time, and you kind of get more reliant on them. It's kind of like if you first start out coding in a integrated development environment, or IDE, you can get over reliant on things like auto completion. Now, as we'll get into later in the episode in the nerdy things section, auto completion is a beautiful thing, and I love it very, very much. And when it is not present, I notice it. But the difference here is that even without it, I can still write the code. The point why I like to use auto-completion is it makes me able to write code faster, because I don't have to type out all of the methods all the time. I can just start typing the method I want, and then it'll kind of pre-populate that, and then I can just complete it. But if you're reliant on the auto-completion to, understand what methods are available to you, that's where it can become more of a hindrance rather than a benefit. So kind of getting into another thing being dependency, the more you use these tools, kind of the more dependent you'll become on them, and the less you'll be able to kind of be self-reliant when it comes to writing your own code. And as a quick, I guess, not disclaimer, but word of advice, if you are learning to code and you want to get a job as a software developer, if you ever run into an interview with a company, you'll almost certainly, now granted, it varies depending on which companies you're trying to work for, but a lot of companies, especially the bigger ones, will make you write code as part of the interview process. And not like, here's some code, here's like an assignment, go write some code and submit it like you would do for like a school project. But they actually, have a live environment where they're watching you write code to see if you actually know how to code. And you can't go out to the internet and go to your favorite, AI model to ask it for the solution. And so if you're over-reliant and dependent on those things, it kind of hinders your ability to be, I guess, self-reliant and to be able to ace those interviews, I guess, and then get the job. But even still, I guess if you did try to use some of those other tools, one, it'd probably be pretty obvious, and two, that would almost certainly immediately disqualify you from the job. So that is another reason why you definitely don't want to be using AI code generation, especially if you're learning to code. But even if you've been coding for a while, this is still something you have to be mindful of becoming overly reliant and dependent on these things. And another one, which we've kind of touched on already in previous episodes where we were talking about the whole GitHub Copilot lawsuit thing, you get into this weird kind of legal gray area. Now, of course, I'm not a lawyer, but you get into this kind of weird gray area of who actually owns the code, right? Because if you didn't write it and an AI generated it, who actually owns the code? Because there is part of the GitHub case, one of the arguments was that the AI was essentially reciting back verbatim code from code bases on GitHub and not citing them, essentially plagiarizing the code, in which case again, you can kind of see the legal issues that you kind of run into, especially when you're dealing with licenses, because if you, say, for instance, copy code from a repository that's using the GPL3 license, for instance, your project is now, by the terms of the license, GPL3 because of the viral nature of the GPL license. Now, again, I'm not a lawyer, but essentially how the GPL license works, in my layman understanding, is it's viral in the sense that if you use code or parts of a project that has the GPL license, the GPL3 license or GPL2 or any of them, your code now also has to be licensed under the GPL. So if you happen to use an AI to generate code for you that just so happened to take code from a project that was a GPL, say 3 licensed code base, and you put it into yours, your code base now has to be GPL 3. Now, depending on the code you're working on, that may or may not be an issue. If you are, writing code for a company and your code base is proprietary, you can bet that is now a massive issue. So yeah. And the other thing, I guess, some of I guess the last thing I want to touch on here is, while using AI generated code can make you a bad programmer, like the article points out, it also, if used correctly, can be a useful tool as well. So, like I mentioned, it's generally fairly decent at least giving you a structure of how the code should flow, even if the code, one, doesn't even work, and two, it completely made up methods and functions that don't actually exist in the API, the library, or framework that you're telling it to use. But at least it can, generally speaking, give you a decent outline. It's just like with Stack Overflow too, right? You don't want to be overly dependent on Stack Overflow to solve all your problems for you, but that's also not to say you should completely avoid it and never use it at all, because it is a very valuable resource that does have a lot of good solutions on there to help you, overcome some challenges, but at the same time, you don't want to become overly reliant on those. Because I guess one last thing I'll touch on, it's probably a good segue into the nerdy thing segment, is when I was trying to write the Xcode generating script in Python, I wanted to do it in Python, but I just figured I would throw out the question to an AI to see what it would spit back at me. And it spit out a script, which of course didn't work, but it looked fairly promising. Now, when I look at the differences between the script that the AI spit out versus the script that I ended up writing that ended up working, They're obviously completely different because my script actually works where the AI script doesn't at all. But at least the flow of the methodology of how to go about, adding things to the project, creating it, things like that, the structure is kind of sort of there. Like it is similar in that sense. But again, the AI kind of made up functions tried to use a certain Python library to generate Xcode projects, but the functions that it was calling was more akin to a different Python library used to generate Xcode projects. So it was kind of a whole mishmash of things from all over the place as well as made up stuff. But at the very least, it did at least send me down semi the right path. Now, if you listen to the past couple weeks, you'll know I spent hours and hours and hours troubleshooting and debugging the script to actually get it to work like I wanted it to. But it at least kind of sort of gave me some ideas about what I should be looking into in order to get it working. So, yeah, that was kind of the thing I wanted to cover with that. And I think that's probably a pretty good transition into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So, the big thing that I kind of got up to this week was working on a config file system for my video game. Now, if you ask me, if you're trying to produce any sort of software that you want to be used by average users and not specifically developers or just by you, a config file is basically a necessity. And the reason for that is the last thing you want to have your users doing is recompiling the source code every time they want to change something about how the program operates, right? So if, for instance, you had to recompile every video game you played whenever you wanted to tweak a graphics setting or change the screen resolution, that would be a royal pain in the butt. And I'm sure no company would want to give you their source code for the game in order for you to recompile it just for whenever you wanted to tweak a minor setting like that. So config files are essentially a necessity, especially for large-scale projects and anything you want to be used by the masses. Because in addition to not having to go through the hassle of recompiling it all the time, the other thing is you can't necessarily expect all of your users to have all the various development tools that your computer has in order to build the code in the first place. Because especially when you're dealing with fairly complex projects, there are generally a lot of various build dependencies that go into building that project. Now, if you're super hardcore, I guess you could write everything yourself and have no dependencies, but that would be quite the undertaking, especially depending on what you're trying to do. But all this to be said, I started work on handling how I wanted to go about doing config files. So I got the loading and saving of a config file working, but I'm still in the process of trying to make it as reusable as possible. So currently right now I just have a proof of concept set up where only one actual config value is being written and read from the config file. But again, this is just purely for testing purposes. But the thing that I really need to identify is how to optimally read in and write these config files without them essentially turning into a massive if-else statement. Because unlike my save data, I can't just serialize the config file and call it a day. Because the nice thing about serializing everything is it's very quick and efficient to deserialize everything in a very optimized manner. But the problem is I want the config file to be human readable and human interactable so the user can actually modify the config file easily. without, having to have a very intricate knowledge of the structure of the and of the compressed data. So yeah, there's definitely some things that I kind of have to figure out there. Because having an if-else statement to check for every single string comparison is, one, not a very clean solution, it's not very reusable, and it's also not exactly the most optimal either. But again, you got to start somewhere. So I just kind of got the baby steps of it implemented there in the first place. So I was at least happy with that. And over the next couple weeks, I'll continue to kind of build it out and flesh it out. But the other thing that I got up to this week was removing unnecessary stuff from the Git history. Now, younger me would have been completely terrified at the idea of having to essentially remove things from Git history and essentially rewrite the Git history, because it is a very daunting task, don't get me wrong. But there is a fairly useful tool out there. I think it was called Git Filter Repo, if I remember correctly. And essentially, what that allowed you to do, you basically just fed it a folder. So in this case, I wanted to remove folders. So you basically just give it the folder, and it removes it all for you. And kind of the genesis of me wanting to remove stuff was, now that I have a script that can auto-generate Xcode files for me, I figured I didn't need to keep the Xcode project file in the repo anymore. Now, granted, I never should have had it in the repo to begin with, but naive me wasn't thinking that through when he initially created the repo about 3 years ago. But the other thing of it, too, was when I first created the repo, the Xcode project was the only way to actually build the project. Because when I first created it, there was no makefile, there was no build system. The build system was Xcode. But then, of course, since then, I've made the game cross-platform. I have a fairly detailed makefile that has superseded Xcode in terms of actually building the video game. Now, granted, you can still build it with Xcode, and that's generally what I do day to day if I'm just doing basic development work. But if I actually want to do legitimate in air quotes builds of it, I do drop down to the command line and use the actual makefile in order to do those things. And then any parts of the automated build system, like the Ansible playbooks, the CI/CD pipelines, all of that uses the makefile for actually building the game itself. But kind of getting back to removing things from the Git history, the Xcode project files was something that I definitely wanted to remove, because now I can just auto-generate them, because the original reason for having the Xcode files in the repo was so I could be lazy and just clone the repo to a new Mac, which the Mac is my primary development platform of choice, and I would be instantly up and running and able to start coding right where I left off and building and all that good stuff. But now, like I said, I can just generate the Xcode project files at will, so it basically makes zero sense to have them included in the repo. So that's what initially sent me down this rabbit hole. But then in the process of analyzing the Git logs to make sure that everything was removed, I noticed other things in there that shouldn't be in there. No, I'm not talking about credentials, but I'm talking about things like raylib libraries, like the actual libraries themselves. Things like one of the most rookie mistakes in the book, which is including build artifacts in the Git repository. Things like this, kind of some boneheaded mistakes. The build artifacts was obviously a boneheaded mistake, because I think it was like 4 or 5 commits later I realized it and then removed it from Git, but it's still within the history, and the files still exist in there. So I had to remove them. But the Raylib libraries was kind of a different use case. And I touched on this in previous episodes a while back, but kind of as a recap, the original reason why I included the Raylib libraries in the repo itself was so I didn't have to worry about making sure that they were installed on the system. And this originally worked okay, but then when I was working with various Linux distributions, I ran into some glibc issues. And what it basically turned out to be was the system that the pre-built Raylib libraries were compiled with was compiled with a newer version of glibc than what was on the Linux distribution I was running. So glibc got mad because things it was looking for didn't exist, and it caused the builds to fail. So then, of course, my solution to that was, okay, I can just download the Raylib release and build the libraries myself, which at this point, that entire process is automated through the makefile. So you can even if you have no... even if you don't even have the Raylib libraries or the source code at all, if you try to build the project, one of the first things it'll do is check to see if the Raylib libraries are installed, and if they're not, it'll go through the process of building them, and in order to build them, you need to have the source code, and if you don't, in order to get the source code, you have to go download it, and it's kind of like this whole like nested chain of like checks to make sure, but needless to say, the entire process of building the libraries for the specific platform you're trying to build the game for is all automated through the makefile. So the need for the Raylib libraries is basically zero at this point, so removed them. I guess in theory, if I wanted to roll way back to sometime in the past for whatever reason, which I have no intentions to do, but if I did, that would, in theory, cause issues. But like I said, I don't necessarily plan to do that. But the point of this being, the total repo size before I kind of went through this removal process was about 22 megabytes. And once I finished removing all these unneeded files, it went down to just under 2 megabytes. So I essentially removed about 20 megabytes worth of bloat from the repo, which is fantastic to see. The other thing it also did was it actually deleted some commits too. So essentially in some of those commits, for instance, where the only thing that was changed in the commit was, say, adding the new version of the Raylib library, because that commit was then empty, the git filter repo would essentially just remove those commits from the history. So that was pretty cool to see, and definitely a much needed cleanup for the Git history. But one kind of weird quirk that I noticed this week when I was doing my development was my Xcode project generation for Xcode 16 is able to compile the project, but that's about all it can do. And I touched on earlier, I kind of alluded to this segment earlier in the podcast when I was mentioning the whole auto-completion thing and using it as a crutch. Well, for whatever reason, my auto-generated Xcode 16 project had absolutely zero support for any kind of auto-completion or code suggestions at all. And if you're using an integrated development environment or an IDE, one of the main reasons you use one is for those exact features. So needless to say, I was quite bummed, and throughout the process of trying to implement the portion of the config that I did get implemented, I was constantly trying to tweak and figure things out about how I could go about actually getting this auto-completion stuff to work. So the long story short is I did some digging, and essentially how I went about doing my solution for the Xcode 16 projects was pretty dumb, because Xcode apparently doesn't like symlinks at all. So, as a quick recap for how I generated the Xcode projects, with Xcode 16, Apple essentially redesigned how Xcode looks for source files. And their methodology and reasoning for this is when you would add a new source file to your Xcode project, if you had Git set up for that Xcode project, you not only would have to add the new source file, but also the Xcode project.pb.proj, I think, something like that. Basically, the internal Xcode project file that basically keeps track of all the source files. And this was causing all kinds of issues with Git and like merge issues and all that jazz. So Apple basically revamped how they did that. But the problem is Xcode now trying to be smart and essentially auto-index everything. Any like directory or source file or anything within the source code directory that Xcode is looking in automatically will try to be compiled by Xcode. And I tried to exclude things. That didn't really work. At least I couldn't get it to work. And it was just a nightmare. Things weren't working. So I ended up going essentially the nuclear route and re-architecting the entire directory structure of my project specifically to support Xcode 16. Was it worth it? I guess I'll report back later. But maybe this is the copium talking to make me feel like this whole effort was actually worth it. But I feel like overall, the re-architecture was not only needed, but also makes things a lot cleaner and overall better. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a horrible process to go through, because not only did I have to move folders and files all around in order to get it to work, but that also had the additional side effect of causing some scripts and the make file especially to break, because the paths that I had in them for, where the source directories were and everything are now in different locations. So they essentially broke. So I had to go through and update things like the Ansible playbooks, the various Python scripts and other bash scripts, and of course the make file in order to get them to actually work. But with all that said, kind of like I mentioned, overall, the repository now I think is much cleaner and better structured. So previously, basically everything was in one directory. And what I mean by that is not just the source code was in that directory, but also other things that quite honestly had no reason being in there. So previously, within the source directory, you had not only the source code, but you had other things like the app resources to essentially, have the app icon, the Windows version information. It had things like all the various graphical assets in there. It had all of my Ansible playbooks in there and my various scripts to automate various things like generating the Xcode project, pulling down the Raylib source, things like that. So it had all these things that weren't necessarily part of the source code of the project, so they shouldn't have actually been in that project folder where the source code resides, if that makes sense. So now within the source code folder, the only code, well, I guess it is code, the only files in there are the source code files. So it's actually kind of how it's supposed to be, I guess. So I think overall it's a lot better structured. And also kind of as a side effect of this, it made the implementation of going through and adding all the source files to the kind of the legacy Xcode projects a lot simpler and a lot more streamlined. So I guess it did kind of have that benefit to it as well. But yeah, so I did test it and everything's working good now. I get my auto completion back in my modern Xcode, so I'm happy about that. I guess the main gotcha that I have, not specifically with the re-architecting of the project directory, but going back a little bit to rewriting the Git history. Whenever you go through an endeavor like that of rewriting Git history, there's a couple things that you really have to be careful about. The first one is you're not going to be able to push to your remote repository unless you do a force push, which depending on your project repo settings may or may not be possible depending on what privileges you have. And the other thing is anyone that then tries to pull down your changes will probably not like you very much because they can't pull down your changes because of the conflicting Git histories. But there's a couple different ways that you can go about solving this problem. But since I'm essentially a one-man show here and I know whatever I push to the remote is essentially my golden image of sorts or kind of the new best baseline that I have, I can essentially blow away any of my other locals because whatever is in the main repo is the known good state. So there's a couple ways that you can do it. You can do the nuclear option where you essentially just blow away the folder and reclone the repository. Or if you don't want to do that, you can essentially fetch from the remote and then you can reset to the remote. So essentially what that looks like, which is going to be really hard without actually seeing the words, is you call a git fetch, and then if you do a git reset -- hard, and then whatever your remote repository's name is, typically origin / whatever the name of the branch is, that will essentially reset your local repository to be equivalent to the history and everything of the remote, so you don't have to necessarily worry about the whole unrelated Git histories nonsense. But there's, like I said, there's a couple ways to go about doing it, but that is something you do have to be careful with if you want to go about rewriting Git history. But it can be done, so I just wanted to kind of put that out there. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on today for this episode is talking about ransomware, kind of the histories of it, some of the tactics used, and kind of ways to defend against it. Now, we've talked about ransomware in the past as kind of a topic or idea, like kind of we've touched on what it is, this idea that it's malware that encrypts victims' data and essentially demands payment in order for decryption. But we've never really gone into kind of where it came from and kind of how it's evolved. So that's kind of what I wanted to touch on for the remainder of this episode. So in the early days, ransomware, kind of like I think most malware, was mainly just kind of an experiment to kind of see, what it could do. So the first known ransomware was called the AIDS Trojan that came out back in the 1980s, 1989 to be specific. And this was a fairly primitive ransomware, at least compared to modern day ransomware, because back in this time, a couple things. One, the internet didn't really exist per se. It wasn't necessarily the infrastructure of the internet was very limited back then. And it basically did the bare minimum of what ransomware would do, essentially encrypting files on the system and demanding payment for them. But back in this time, it was demanding payment through mail, not email or like a digital payment, like actual mail in order to unlock. And the motivation for this ransomware, kind of like I touched on with a lot of early malware, was kind of for experimentation purposes. Ironically, one of the reasons for it was to kind of experiment with seeing how monetizing cybercrime through coercion would actually work. And as we've kind of seen in the modern day, cybercrime is a very lucrative business these days, which is rather unfortunate, but that's, I guess, the world we live in. But seeing that this was the 80s, there wasn't necessarily means of distribution like phishing attacks or malicious links on websites or zero-day vulnerabilities through networked devices or things like that. It was mainly distributed through like floppy disks. So the scope of the infection of it was a lot more limited than something nowadays with the internet. And because encryption standards back then were not nearly as robust as they were today, it essentially just relied on basic obfuscation for its encryption. But then when we kind of move into some more of the modern day ransomware into the 2000s and even into modern day, we start to see the emergence of ransomware making use of more encryption based, your standard encryption systems like RSA and AES algorithms for the encryption. And this is kind of, I guess, from the attacker's perspective, beneficial because in like the case of, AES and RSA, it's fairly easy to encrypt all the data and at the same time not allow the user to decrypt it unless you give them either the password in the case of AES or say the private key in the case of RSA in order to decrypt their data. And also kind of around this time, this was kind of in the early days of cryptocurrencies, specifically Bitcoin. In the kind of the early days is what payments were typically kind of wanted in, although nowadays it's still a common payment method for ransomware, although if threat actors are smart about it, they'd probably use something more like Monero, which is a lot more untraceable compared to Bitcoin because Bitcoin, everything's easily on the blockchain. It wasn't designed with privacy in mind, so you can easily trace every kind of transaction from one account to another. So in theory, you could easily de-anonymize any user on the Bitcoin network by kind of tracing where the money's going. Now, that's not to say if you're already this deep into your criminal masterminding that you're not using some kind of money laundering scheme on top of all of this, which again, you shouldn't be doing. But I'm just kind of, saying how it is with, various threat actors. If you're going through the hassle of committing cybercrime, I mean, what's another step in money laundering, right? I mean, that's, I guess, kind of like a drop in the bucket. But kind of the more modern day incarnation of ransomware that we're seeing now is this idea of ransomware as a service. And we've touched on it before on the podcast in the past, but kind of as a quick recap, essentially the goal, I guess, if you will, of ransomware as a service is you as a threat actor find some kind of zero-day vulnerability or some other means of getting into a system, and then you ask one of these ransomware providers, I guess, if you will, to essentially do the rest, right? Like you break into the system and then you have the ransomware guys deploy the ransomware on that system and handle all the payments and all that good stuff. And then you essentially get a cut of the ransom, assuming it actually gets paid out. So that's kind of the modern day, I guess, vibe, which I mean, I guess kind of makes sense, right? Since everything these days has to be a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, everything as a service. So some of the, I guess, kind of in the modern day, one of the more notable kind of ransomwares was the WannaCry ransomware, which kind of ravaged both hospitals and businesses alike by exploiting the external blue vulnerability. But I guess another thing you have to kind of think about when it comes to ransomware is kind of what is the driving factor for threat actors to even go through with ransomware. And I think the most obvious one, first and foremost, is the financial aspect, because the whole point of ransomware is to make money, right? The whole point of it is you encrypt someone's data and basically demand money in order for them to get their data back. And kind of the targets, tend to be, the medium to small businesses and even enterprises. But also we've also seen in recent years a kind of a spike in things like hospitals and energy and kind of infrastructure companies as well getting hit with ransomware. And one of the reasons why, if at all possible, you don't want to pay the ransom is because once you pay the ransom, these ransomware companies identify you as someone that has paid the ransom in the past and will probably pay again. So they're just going to keep trying to come after you to keep getting that recurring money, right? It's like a subscription service if you want to think of it in kind of that way. That they're trying to keep coming after you to keep getting that recurring ransom payment. But kind of on another reason why ransomware, another motivation for ransomware is any sort of state-sponsored type threat acting, right? I don't know if that's the proper use of the term, but, state-sponsored actors, I mean, they're at the will of their governmental organization right now. Governments are going to be governments. They're always spying on each other and trying to get the upper hand on everyone. So, I mean, there's that motivation at all in that sense. And when it comes to state-sponsored stuff, that's really where things really get kind of nefarious in the sense, because money to these state-sponsored threat actors is basically no object. Unlike, your script kiddie hacker in his mom's basement, if they can't break into something in, a minute or two or a couple minutes, they're probably going to give up and move on to a more easy target to prey on. But a state-sponsored threat actor is more than willing to spend thousands, tens, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars going after specific targets that they believe could be in their best interest to either deploy ransomware on or otherwise harm through means of some kind of cyber event in order to, exfiltrate data, spy, gather intelligence, whatever the case may be. Money is essentially no object to state actors, which is kind of why they can be so dangerous when it comes to the cybersecurity realm. Because unlike, kind of your average Joe, if they can't hack into you immediately, they're not just going to give up and go to the next person that's a lot easier to break into. If they want to get you, they're going to keep working until they get you. And kind of one of the last main motivating driving factors for threat actors is kind of I guess for the lols, you could say, or for the memes, kind of the hacktivist kind of mentality, or the rogue, threat actors that are just kind of doing things to disrupt or just sabotage for whatever reason. They're not really doing it for the money. They're just kind of doing it because they want to, just for like pure chaos reasons. So those are just kind of some of the main motivations. Now, when it comes to the evolution of the techniques to kind of deploy the ransomware, we kind of already touched on some of them, being like the improvements in encryption, kind of shifting from just generic obfuscation to actually using legitimate encryption algorithms like AES and RSA, as well as others. But also the distribution means have changed, obviously, as well, too, with the age of the internet. Things like phishing attacks through phishing emails is fairly common, malicious links on websites. But nowadays, also with all the various exploits around the world that are constantly popping up on a daily basis, any kind of zero-day vulnerability that can give you remote code execution is another way that threat actors go about getting malware onto systems, because if you can fully compromise a system in that way through some kind of zero-day with remote code execution, you're basically toast at that point. So those are some other common methods as well. But in addition to that, like previously, kind of in the olden days, the means of ransomware was literally just encrypting your files and wanting money to allow you to decrypt your files. But nowadays, they're kind of dipping as many times as they can dip and going for maybe a double dip or even a triple dip. And nowadays, like if they can say they exploit some 0-day, which gives them like remote access to your system, they not only can deploy ransomware to encrypt all your data, but also exfiltrate all your data. So now they can get you, one, to pay them to be able to decrypt your data, and two, pay them so they don't leak your data out on the dark web. And again, you're dealing with threat actors here, so can you really trust anything they've said? If they've already gotten a copy of all of your data that they've encrypted, one, they would have the keys, so the fact that it's encrypted means nothing to them because they can just decrypt it. And two, who's to say that they haven't already leaked the data onto the dark web before you've even made your payment, or if you did make the payment, they did it anyway. So, yeah. So they're definitely getting up to some very nefarious things there. But again, it kind of goes back to, you don't want to pay the ransom. If at all possible, try not to pay the ransom, because it just kind of makes you more of a target. And especially now, with the whole exfiltration of data, they're basically extorting you to basically pay them even more money so they don't leak that data out onto, the dark web. Now, we've talked a lot about ransomware, but how can you actually defend against it? So one of the most proactive ways you can do it is the robust backup strategy, which we've talked about before, that being the 3-2-1 backup, that being 3 copies of the data on 2 different storage types, and one of those being off-site. Because if you have an off-site backup, even if you're a threat actor gets in and totally destroys your network and ransomware is everything, you at least have that one offsite backup that you can recover from. Similarly, if you go through the method of having a cold storage backup solution, where you have some kind of storage that's completely offline, not plugged into anything, not accessible on the network or anything like that, that can be another means as well to be able to recover in the event that you do get hit by ransomware. The other thing, too, is to patch and update software to close known vulnerabilities. And this is kind of key because, as we kind of touched on in the telecom section, one of the reasons that telecom companies kept getting hacked was, outdated firmware on, switches and routers and things like that. So one of the simplest ways to protect yourself and kind of strengthen your security is to make sure you're up on those software and security updates in order to prevent those easily known vulnerabilities like that. And the last one I want to touch on as far as proactive measures is another one that we've touched on fairly consistently on the podcast, which is network segmentation to limit lateral movement. Because as ransomware continues to evolve and get smarter, one thing that's fairly common for ransomware to do nowadays is to basically, once it infects your system, it'll basically just sit there. And it will monitor, things going on the network to identify targets, to even see if you're worth infecting in the first place. And one thing that they'll like to target is file servers, specifically like a NAS, for instance, because that's where all the good, juicy data is. Because a web server, that's cool to ransomware, but if you can get someone's like NAS that has all of their data, all of their files, everything, that's going to be more likely to make them pay the ransom, whereas some, throwaway web server. And it's even more so in like business environments too, if ransomware can get in there. So if you the better network segmentation you have, the less ransomware would be able to kind of identify what's on the network and potentially, one, spread, and two, maybe it'll just decide that you don't have any good targets on the network. But one of the kind of issues with that too, like I touched on with ransomware kind of getting more advanced, kind of one of the new trends and what's coming next for ransomware is, in addition to targeting critical infrastructure like healthcare and energy and infrastructure and that kind of thing, It's also using like AI to, like I said, we've said before, cybersecurity is a never ending arms race, and AI is essentially the next line in the arms race. But the other thing with it too is because ransomware now can just kind of sit idly, monitoring the network. One of the issues with backups is the ransomware could actually be in your backups potentially. If it was sitting on your, say, a server that you were backing up for, say, every week for the past 3 weeks, and the ransomware has been on there for 2 of those weeks and decides to go into action and infect you, depending on which like snapshot or backup you roll back to, the ransomware could still be there, which means it could get you again. So that is one thing to kind of be mindful of as well. But as far as detecting ransomware, there's a couple things that you can do. One, having monitoring for suspicious activity. So if you have any kind of like antivirus software running, that could be a tool. If you have like an intrusion detection or prevention system, that could also be a useful tool as well. But the big thing that is fairly obvious with ransomware is the mass encryption of files, because that's basically what it does. So having a endpoint kind of security system to be able to detect that and shut it down is a pretty good detection and response mechanism for that too. And also conducting regular incident response drills as well, to kind of make sure that people are aware of, if something happens like this, they can be ready for it. And that kind of goes into the next thing about, making sure employees are trained to understand and recognize phishing attempts and various kinds of phishing attacks. We've touched on a couple of ways to kind of identify various phishing attacks. One of the big ones is check the email address of the person sending you the email. If it's claiming to be from your bank, but the email that it was being sent from was an email that is obviously not your bank, definitely not a legit email. The other thing to check for is any kind of links that get sent within the email itself. If it's claiming it's sending you to, say, your bank's website, but in the actual URL, one of the O's is actually a 0 and the name's slightly misspelled, that's another red flag. But one of probably the best ways to help prevent yourself from phishing attacks like that is, if you see any kind of suspicious email, whether it's from your bank or from social media or from anything, the best and most secure way to going about checking to see if it's legit is to ignoring the email entirely for a second, logging into your account directly through the known website, right? So if it's your bank, you go directly to your bank's website and log in. And if there actually is an issue with your account or something, it should be fairly plain as day when you log in that something is up. And alternatively, you could just kind of call the customer service helpline that's like on your actual bank's website in this case, and kind of say, hey, I got this email, is this legit or not, and kind of confirm it that way before you go clicking random links and signing into a site that ends up being a phishing site, or a malicious link that ends up downloading malware, in this case ransomware, since that's what we're talking about. But this also, like I said, goes to not only employee training, but also, making sure that your friends and family members are also aware of phishing attempts as well, because like I said, it's not just like the small businesses and enterprises that are getting, attacks like this. It's also, just your standard everyday users as well. Basically, any low-hanging fruit that these threat actors can go after, they're going to go after. So we kind of touched on some of what's next for ransomware, some of the kind of emerging trends, that being going after critical infrastructure and AI. But as far as like future defenses go, one way that you can also help defend yourself is shifting to a zero trust architecture, or essentially this idea of assuming no user or device should ever be trusted by default, regardless of whether they're inside or outside of your network. So this is essentially like, if you have a server and your development machine has been communicating to the server for months now and everything's hunky-dory, the zero trust architecture would say that your server there should never inherently trust your development machine just because it has been good in the past, right? It kind of goes back to kind of builds upon the idea of the principle of least privilege, and going back also to the idea in software development where whenever you're dealing with user input, you should always assume the user input you got is malicious until you can verify otherwise that it is not malicious. Because if you go in with that mindset, it can help prevent from things like SQL injections, command injections, buffer overflows, and things like that, because you're assuming going in that the data you're getting is malicious, and only after you then verify that it is not, you then go ahead and process it. And the other thing, as far as like, future defenses as well, is we've touched on it before, is this idea of honeypots, which are essentially ways to lure in threat actors to deploy their malware or ransomware onto, in order for cybersecurity researchers to essentially be able to harvest that, and then within a controlled environment be able to analyze how it works, how it functions, in order to capture signatures of it to be added to various antivirus software, but also kind of detect what it tries to do, so you can do a more heuristics-based approach, which is essentially this idea where rather than identifying a signature of an executable, which is fairly limited in its capabilities, you can do a heuristics approach where if you see an executable, doing X, Y, and Z in a specific order, that tends to be, a thing that malware likes to do or ransomware likes to do. So go ahead and shut that off and stop it because it's probably malicious. So that's kind of how the heuristics tend to work in these kinds of antivirus programs and software. And really the only way that that's possible is to actually have, experience with the ransomware or malware or whatever. And the safest way to do that is to be able to harvest it through something like a honeypot, and then within a controlled environment be able to kind of unleash it, if you will, to really study it, reverse engineer it, and kind of see what makes it tick. So that was kind of a little bit more into ransomware. I know, like I said, we've touched on it in the past, but I kind of wanted to go into it more and kind of flesh out, where it's kind of come from, its beginnings, rather than just it's a thing and, it encrypts stuff. So yeah. But before we end this episode, because we are running a little long, I wanted to end with our trivia question. So, which company was founded first? Nintendo, Microsoft, Apple, or Sony? If you said Nintendo, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And as another little bit of trivia, Nintendo was founded in 1889. That's correct, 1889. And it was originally a manufacturer of playing cards, so it wasn't making video games back in 1889, probably because they didn't exist back then. But that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. So if you enjoyed, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and be sure to share it with a friend or family member. And if you have any questions about this week's episode, or have any ideas, comments, topics, or ideas for future episodes, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. The link is down in the show notes below. Or if you're on YouTube, you can just leave a comment down below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast. So, fun fact about this episode, this is actually the second time I recorded it, because when I got to the point talking about is AI bad, will make you a bad programmer. For whatever reason, like halfway through me talking about that, Logic Pro decided that it wanted to switch my input device from my microphone to my iPhone. So I ended up recording like probably 60% of the episode through my phone's speaker, which was hot dog water. So, yeah. Anyway, have a good one. I'll see you in the next one.